Hi, thanks for tuning in to our Practical Nerds weekly podcast. I'm Shubh, and together with my partner and co host Patrick, we normally invest in founders in design, construction, renovation, and logistics technology. Many of our friends in the ecosystem wanted us to start a podcast on the built world, and in return, we decided to honor their request with a show about nothing at all. Hey Patrick, so we are back again after a bit of a break.
Indeed, indeed. You have been traveling through Asia. How was it?
It was good, quite intense. Much hotter, obviously, than what we experienced in Europe, but a nice change. Um, but hey, on the subject of being off for a bit of a break, you could say we had and I'm trying really hard. I'm trying really hard to create smooth segue here. You could say we went through, you know, ups and downs with our schedule, right? You could almost say we had some seasonality in there.
Yes. Yeah. So if the listeners are now wondering, huh? How is that a segue? Well, we're going to talk about the impact of different types of seasonalities that we have been observing over the years in construction markets, adjacent markets that affect the founders that we've partnered with and startups that we've seen over the years. And it's not always the same seasonality is what makes it interesting. And when you see seasonality, it can actually be having different implications for your company depending on what you sell. We'll unpack that. So we're going to talk about seasonality, its implications, and how you can deal with it, and that not every seasonality is the exact same thing. Before we do that, actually, I noticed one thing, Shub, during the intro, which you had recorded. So in the intro, we're saying built world, right? Actually, in our so we relaunched our website, fundamental.com, big success so far. It's got a huge content hub. If you haven't seen it, go there. And as part of that, also, we've updated after the first 5 years of Fundamental, the community letter for the next 5 years. We talked about that here. In it, we use the term real world. So perhaps we need to re-record the intro.
Yeah, perhaps we should. Perhaps we should.
Are you down for it?
I am. Yeah.
Okay, good. So
I'll maybe come in a little bit better prepared and not just randomly wing it this time around.
no, I think that, no. Why change a winning model?
Yeah. Winning model.
Why change a model? Just model. Yeah.
Let's go. Let's go with that.
Awesome. So I'd love for you to kick us off with an anecdote before so sorry, how we're going to do it is like in the first half of the episode we're all going to collect just anecdotes, and then in the second half of the discussion we're going to focus on the implications for founders, and how to deal with it. Before you kick us off with the first episode, let's just briefly define seasonality, right? So I'm going to wing this one, but seasonality, what we mean in the context of this episode is that, hey, you're a startup or a scale-up serving the AECS markets, architecture, engineering, construction, and supply chain markets. And in the underlying markets that you serve, the customers, the suppliers, the partners that you have in your business, there are certain days, weeks, or months of the calendar year in which you just cannot grow or even maintain your business in the same way as in the other months. And because that is not a one-off pattern, because it is a repeated pattern that you notice, that's what makes it a seasonality, which on the one hand side is uncontrollable. On the other hand side, and that's a little bit, looking ahead to the second half, it's plannable, it's anticipatable, right? So that's what we mean by seasonality, unless I forgot something, Shub.
No, I think it's perfect.
Then what's an example of seasonality that you have seen over the years that, perhaps I have never heard of?
Okay, so I think you would definitely have heard of, I would say most of these, but I think some of the examples that I'm going to bring up, and I think one in particular will come across as really hilarious and completely wacky and, maybe otherworldly almost to listeners of our show. But maybe let's start off with a very simple one, right? So here at Founderman, we have an inside joke where if things are not going wrong with a firm based in India, we say, hey, it's probably because of the monsoon, right? And for listeners of our show, for those of you who are not familiar, monsoon is a seasonal wind pattern, which causes very intense rains, generally all over the Indian subcontinent. I think it's a few other parts of the world as well, but primarily the Indian subcontinent, typically from June to, say, August or early September. So we're kind
I
of
see.
right now, so we are right now in the monsoon season, in fact. So what happens is, as you would imagine, if you have very intense, almost cyclonic rains in parts of India on a regular basis, it's hard to build a lot of buildings, get infrastructure built. So what generally happens is builders, contractors, etc., take that into consideration and slow down the pace of work. And their plan basically entails operating at a faster speed outside of the monsoon season and slowing down because it's assumed that, hey, there is a inherent bottleneck and you can't deploy people in when it's torrentially raining, etc. Right? And obviously this is common knowledge, but quite often when founders come and tell us, hey, you're going to grow regardless of season, I always stop and question, hey, are you sure? Because it's literally a restriction put by nature on how fast you can grow in those months.
And has that affected several of the portfolio companies on the subcontinent that you have worked with over the years?
So firms operating at scale, it definitely is it's like gravity pulling them down in those months. And interestingly, the most mature founders know that. They don't even try to hide behind the fact. They kind of give a blanket warning that, hey, in these months, expect a slowdown or maybe a slight decline. And in the best company's case, they usually bounce right back. Right? If you're either inexperienced or don't know what you're up against or trying to, I guess, randomly impress investors, you'll still try to make projections and say you can do it. I guess in absolute numbers, you still could because ultimately, for example, if you're talking about revenue, you're talking about number of units times revenue per unit. So you can, obviously, if you're at a small scale, you can just deploy more units and hopefully that works out for you. But if you're at any sort of scale, say close to Series A or above, it will have that gravity-like effect on your ability to scale because especially if you're dealing with real assets, buildings, infrastructure, and of course, a big part of what we do is involved in all of these things. It does have a throttling effect on your growth, for sure.
Got it. And tell me something, is the in the 2.5 months of monsoon that you roughly have, how do companies usually maintain their business? Is it do I have to think of it as, hey, it's shrinking, or is it more like, hey, I'm not growing, I'm maintaining business? What's the impact?
Generally, and your question is with regards to, let's say, scaled up startups, larger corporations. What do you have in mind?
Well, take a pick.
So with larger corporations in the building materials, construction, these kind of industries, if you take a yearly view, you will definitely see a dip in these months on a consistent basis, and they will bounce right back. So what will happen is to kind of have their yearly production targets or yearly building targets, it'll assume a dip, and the dip, you will see a dip in those months, and it'll bounce right back once the season is gone, once the season is done. And basically the economy or the clients are hungry for that work to be done, but they've kind of kept themselves in a sort of dormant situation because of the excessive rain. But therefore, once the rain recedes, it's immediately ready to soak up that demand. The demand doesn't go away. It just is delayed, basically.
Okay. Super clear. Super clear. You have more interesting anecdotes from your markets. Perhaps we go there before we go there. So I cover Europe for us as well as LATAM, and in Europe, let's pick the French market for a minute. So the French market, if you're not familiar with it, you will know that you won't know that it is a market that has typically an unusually long summer break. I mean, Europeans in general have, I think, the worldwide reputation.
Yes.
Really taking their breaks. But within that, the French have the reputation to really take their break.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And so that's why France, for example, from a public school holiday calendar perspective, the schools will typically be closed for July and August. So the students which work very hard during the rest of the year get 2 months off, and that's also where most of the business will actually shut down in France. So that is one effect of seasonality, where if you have a French or if you have a company that does business in France, typically in July and August, if you're an ARR model, nobody will cancel the contract. So you'll probably plateau and maintain, but you won't grow or add significant amount of revenue. If you're a marketplace business, or if you're financial services business, something like that, you might still maintain it, because not everybody is gone for 8 weeks, but it will be substantially tougher to actually earn an ROI on the overhead that you're having. So that's already the case. Now, what's interesting is that a lot of building activity gets actually done between end of January, early February, and then end of June and early July. September, October, November, December are also months in which building activity happens, but at a what I've been observing, slightly slower pace, less hectic, perhaps I should say, pace than in the first half of the year. And that's interesting, because what I've noticed is actually the implications for different types of models of startups are completely different, although the underlying business condition of seasonality is the same. So portfolio companies that sell software into the construction industry during the high season months that I just mentioned, so they are selling tooling and they need the contractors or the other participants to adopt a new kind of tooling and a new kind of infrastructure. They need to do a little bit of setup, a little bit of training. They really have a hard time to sell during the highest season months of the construction trade, which is counterintuitive. If you come outside as an investor and you're like, hey, what is the most construction activity in your industry, you would be asking this because you think, hey, that's probably where in your P&L I see the best business. But actually, it's the off-season times where people are not on holiday, but also not completely utilized with the projects, where such a software company would be growing the best. So September through December would be best months. But on the other hand, if you're a company addressing the construction trade in France with an outcome model, say financial services, for example, marketplace transactions, you will be having your fastest growing months during February through June. And then you will still be growing, of course, through September and December. So same condition, underlying condition, but completely different impact depending on what you're selling into the industry, right? And so that's something I realize only over time.
That is fascinating about how I guess the non-peak months can also prove to be the best months for certain kinds of companies.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I want to come back. So obviously the summer is one of would you say it is perhaps the most important holiday season, but I want to come back to the topic of holiday seasons around the end of the year in a bit, because I think that's also definitely seasonal and can have big impacts. And for my next anecdote, I want to, before I come back to India, I want to go around the world a little bit to maybe discuss some other interesting seasonality patterns we've observed. So one interesting pattern I've seen in countries that follow the Islamic faith, so think of Indonesia, think of countries in the Middle East, is obviously every year there's the month of Ramadan, followed by Eid, although I think Eid is referred to by different names in different parts of the world. What you'll find is an interesting aspect where during the month of Ramadan, the output kind of dips slightly. And there's a very interesting reason for it, for those of you not familiar, because people are fasting. There's supposed to be a rule on how many hours of work people are allowed to do. So again, with a very there's a clear bottleneck established on how productive people can be. Because you're not, for those who are fasting, obviously are constrained by that. Those who are not fasting, they also are not allowed to work beyond a certain amount of time. So that puts a ceiling on how much output you can deliver. And this is then followed by a few days or maybe even a week or 10 days of celebration for Eid, depending on which country you are in. And that then leads to a dramatic fall in those days. So what you have, if you're plotting a chart, let's say you're a business growing pretty well, you're growing, then you see sort of like a gradual taper during the month of Ramadan. And then you see a sharp decline, right, for about 10 days or so. Now, assuming the business is good, it should bounce right back up once that is done. But that's, again, something to keep in mind. So even going back to my earlier comment, I always get a bit worried when founders operating in these regions also assume that they can just power through this. It's actually very hard if you think about the constraints that they have to deal with.
And is that because people are not reachable, or is it a different, I don't know, state of mind in which they don't want to make whatever certain purchasing decisions, etc.? What have you noticed?
Oh, so this actually I can also answer with some personal experience because I also spent a few years in the Middle East. So what happens is, so imagine a situation where let's say the normal working hours are 9, and for everyone the normal working hours are reduced to say 6 or 7, as in by law that is the requirement that the working hours are reduced during that month.
Right.
And there is a restriction on what sort of food outlets can operate. In fact, during the fasting hours, there is no concept of outdoor eating, right? So what you have to do basically, so if you're fasting, of course you're fasting. If you're not fasting, you're still limited by what you do because of what sort of environments you operate in. So it limits also, it puts limits on your working style, who you go out. You can't, for example, extend hospitality in client meetings and things of that sort. So
Right.
things, so what this also means is if you're having sales meetings, they take on a very different tone. They're not, and especially if you think of places like the Middle East, where hospitality is an important part of business and working culture, they take on a more, if I may call it, sterile tone,
Hmm.
right? Which directly or indirectly may also put some pressure on the ability to close deals, right?
Hmm.
Now, and even if you factor all this in, let's say you're in the process of pitching clients, hey, they are also in a fasted state, right? So they may not always be in a situation where they want to close deals in that state, right? Maybe they want to be done with Ramadan, see through the festival, and then make big decisions,
Hmm.
right? So there's lots of there's legal pressure, there's pressure around what you can do in a meeting setting, and then there's the human physiological factor to it.
That is fascinating. Let me respond with um, something that reminds me of in the Western cultures.
Hmm.
And I'm curious to then hear from you whether something similar would be ongoing in cultures that are closer to the Islamic faith. So in Western cultures, when you approach the end of the calendar year, in most of the Christian faith markets, you would be approaching the holiday season, right? So in the US, it starts a little bit earlier with Thanksgiving, end of November typically, and extends into then the Christmas holidays up until New Year's and right after. And in the European markets, typically Thanksgiving is not a big thing. So, the holiday season would start with people beginning to take off around mid-December earliest, and then also extending into like the first 7-10 days of January. During this time, you will actually see two types of behaviors when it comes to purchasing decisions,
Okay.
typically. And it's a little bit more pronounced in non-owner-led companies. So, for example, large corporates that have certain governance processes, management in place. So that's a bit more pronounced what I'm about to describe. So the one
Hmm.
type of purchasing behavior is when it comes to non-buy ready processes and decisions. So imagine you're proposing as a startup a new type of technology around a construction site that would need the company to also change certain structures, processes, make certain decisions around the infrastructure, cybersecurity, whatever, something like that
Yeah.
would never get done in the holiday
Oh.
season. So that has mostly to do with, in my experience, not actually people being not available because there is a mental wind down going on
Mm.
where everybody's taking it a little bit more easy. They would never admit it. If you ask
Yeah.
this to someone, no, they would never admit it. But it's like everybody is winding down a little bit,
Hmm.
and that starts really then December into the first week of January. Although everybody would still be available to a large degree, and there would be meetings, but it's that
Yeah.
let's call it lethargy. However, here's the opposite side of that. If you're proposing a highly buy-ready
Hmm.
purchasing decision for which perhaps a budget has been set for the calendar year and the budget is not
Okay.
used yet, you can also find the exact opposite behavior where the same person that is lethargic about a change the business purchasing decision could be
Hmm.
very, very quick in decision making on a run the business purchasing decision that they still have budget for. Again, this is pronounced in non-owner-led type companies. So depending on what you sell and what kind of budget and purchasing process you're selling into, you might have, because of the same seasonality effects, two completely different outcomes.
And is this because this is a budget approved for that calendar year or fiscal year, and they need to be done with that budget and use it up?
Correct.
Ah,
That happens
fascinating.
all the time.
Yeah, fascinating. I'm glad you brought that theme up. I was planning to touch that theme as well later in this episode. It's fascinating. That actually also plays out in different parts of the world, depending on when the financial year ends, right? And it's actually very important to know for a VC, right? I think the founders, I guess, should know. I mean, if you don't, shame on you if you don't know when the financial year or the fiscal year ends in your country. But for this reason, what you'll find is, so for example, I mean, in many parts in Europe, for example, the fiscal year ends in December, or it overlaps with the calendar year. But for example, in India and in Singapore, the fiscal year ends on 31st March. In Australia, the fiscal year ends on 30th June, right? So what you'll find is businesses tend to spike up like a month or two leading into the end of the fiscal year for exactly the reason you described.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Do you see that across company models, like what they're selling? Is it the same for software versus, for example, marketplace transactions?
So interesting. So what I've observed, so with Australia, for example, there's an interesting overlay with software. There's an incredible correlation, and you can almost plan for it every year. Software purchases start picking up after Easter is done, so sometime around April, let's say. And obviously June, the end of the fiscal year is smack bang, comes, and you'll kind of see a strong phase up until beginning of summer. So say up until end of October-ish in Australia, right? And I think there's various explanations for it. One is that, maybe the end of the year is the holiday season, end of the year / beginning of the year is the holiday season. The fiscal year is in the middle. So everyone is focused on that part of the year rather than the ends. The other is, hey, once you're done with Easter, you tend to be more focused on work, etc. I don't know. I've heard all kinds of explanations. Perhaps it's a mix of all of these in a market like Australia.
Southern Hemisphere, so let's say April, when this kicks into high gear, is like end of fall, earliest beginning of winter.
Correct. That's right. Yeah. Isn't it fascinating that, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Isn't it fascinating that we use the word seasonality, which obviously bakes in the implication that it's a nature-driven thing, but how often it's an interesting interplay of nature, human-made concepts, right, of law / faith, and also of when we choose to arbitrarily end the fiscal year.
I mean, if you think about it, Ben Franklin was the one that actually proposed prolonging the days by having an additional hour in March and October, right? So that goes back to Ben Franklin's roots actually, and they did that. I hope I'm not butchering it. I'm right now. I haven't reread it, but I'm operating from my history memory here. I think they actually proposed it because they wanted to give the farmers more sleep time with dark hours and more available sun time when they were tending the fields. So that's where actually historically it comes from. Again, another man-made concept, but born in the physiology.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if I should get started on daylight savings. I think what you said about the history is indeed true. I just find it a very bizarre way to rationalize the whole thing, but that's a whole different concept because I feel like we just restrict useful hours that way.
Yeah, and I mean, it's completely, again, butchered, sort of. I mean, if you look at the, what's the north-south? Is that longitude or latitude? That's longitude.
That
right?
would be, north-south would be latitude. Yeah.
Latitude. So if you look at the latitude between, for example, Great Britain and Spain, you will see that Spain is west of Great Britain, but it will be an hour ahead. So that again, I'm not going to get into that because this is not a political and history podcast. But it actually has political reasons dating back to the 1930s. Why Spain, for
Oh.
example, is on German and Italian time zone. So look it up.
Oh, okay. I think I figured out what the
Yeah,
reasoning is. Okay.
yeah, exactly.
Gotcha.
It's quite
Nice.
fascinating, right? But geographically, you actually don't have a good reason for it.
Before we move on to other topics, just to make sure we are also seen as the secular people that we are, because we covered the Islamic faith and the Christian faith, I want to bring up this truly, utterly crazy thing, which even I didn't know about, I must admit, before Fundamental,
Okay.
uh, about seasonality is introduced through the Hindu faith, for example, right? And this in particular relates to one of our portfolio companies, which has since become the leading platform of its kind as a design and build platform for homes in India. Uh, Let me not take their name, but for those familiar, you can easily find out what the name of the company is, backed by tier one VCs, etc., as well in follow-on rounds.
And us.
So, and us as well, right? So the incredible thing is when we were first diligencing the firm back in the day, we were finding there's this peculiar, very sharp and very clear drop, typically in the months of July and early August, like approximately a month. Starts sometime in mid-July, gets done sometime in mid-August, and it sort of changes a little bit on a yearly basis. And then the pattern followed the following year as well. So we were like, hey, what's up with this, right? What does this mean? Why do you see this kind of random and sharp drop, which also seems to repeat the following year around the same time? And they explained that this is a concept of an inauspicious month, as in, if you buy during these times, it's considered inauspicious and a bad time to be owning or buying new assets, especially
Wow.
one where you intend to buy immovable property. And so people just decide not to buy. They just hang around, but they don't close the transaction in that phase. So what will you do if you're a home buying platform? You can't convince them otherwise.
I mean, not to move into the implications, but so that's a perfect month where you're then targeting different faiths. Is that what you're doing?
Probably. And then what they have also done to sort of hedge, and maybe this is a segue to what we will discuss, hedge to also go into parts of the country where this belief was not as widely held. And where, for example, they had a different set of inauspicious months. So you kind of diversify away your seasonality with the inauspicious month for one community not being inauspicious for another community,
Very
etc.
interesting. Does the um, what I want to ask is, in this instance, does the inbound completely break down? Is it that the ongoing conversations that started before that month, like, do they cancel or just not continue? Because I wonder about, like, what does purchasing decision
Yeah,
in this context actually mean?
great question. Everything actually continues as normal in the sense that people are reaching out, people are having conversations, people are soliciting offers, but they don't want to close the transaction in that month.
As an ink the contract.
Exactly.
Okay,
Yeah, that's what happens.
very interesting. And
Yeah.
so does it also mean that the month after the conclusion of that period, you're seeing almost like double the revenue than in
Correct. Exactly. So you then you see a sharp drop and then you see a sudden spike, which was higher than the month before the drop happened.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I got one more. So in energetic renovation in the Western markets, we have a few portfolio companies, for example, Enter, that is probably at the by far largest scale of any of the companies. And so, which means that statistically there we can see it relatively pronounced and there's not like a small baseline effect ongoing. So you can see a very large difference in the growth between the months that follow the summer holidays and go all the way through February and early March when temperature is lower. No summer holidays ongoing, and then when the temperature is picking up, April through July and the summer holiday, August and the summer holidays, and it's completely consistent and expected if you have been a human for more than a year on this planet. So everybody would say, sure, But it's interesting what it means, because it's a completely, again, man-made concept or just psychology in, oh, right now it's warm, I don't need a new insulation.
Yeah.
And that's dumb if you think about it, because actually the insulation cools or retains not just heat inside the home, it also retains cool temperatures inside the home, right? And so if you have ever had a thermos mug under a blanket, with cool water under a blanket, you will know what effect I'm talking about. But still,
Yeah.
psychology is telling us, no, this is more of a winter thing, right? And so it's important to navigate these things properly as a company, have the proper measures in place, take proper overhead decisions, take proper distribution decisions, inform your investors thusly, etc. So Shub, that brings us into the implications
Yeah.
for your business. Do you want to kick us off with like the first recommendation for founders that deal with seasonalities?
Yeah, I think so. We've already touched on some of them, but maybe we can recap before we go into other points which we haven't spoken about. I think in my mind, the first one is to not be in denial about seasonality in your business,
Right.
right? And what I mean by not being in denial is don't put yourself under pressure to give fanciful projections of growing through or powering through these seasonalities. Because, hey, if you say that, you're held accountable for it, and then you may put more pressure and do things which are not healthy for the business, or try to fight too hard against seasonal things that are structurally not meant to be fought against so hard. And the second thing I would say, once you have accepted that these things are there, it will then help you plan for what you should be doing to either counter them or to plan for what happens outside of these seasonalities to grow better, and to therefore take that into consideration for long-term planning of the business.
And what you're describing is extra tricky if your first year of commercialization you didn't feel the seasonality, although you expected it, because you might have been on a baseline effect. So, for example, we're investors in Varm. The company Varm is a company that is a cloud installation business for insulation, retrofit insulation of buildings. And the company is now, I believe, 14 months old, has had a first year of commercialization where I would look at the numbers and I would say, you're not going to see the seasonality in there. They have been growing consistently throughout the first year. Did a fantastic follow-on round based on those numbers, not public yet, but going to be announced soon. But the next year, I can already anticipate from the other seasonalities that we've seen is not going to be the same. Because we've now reached a scale in the business where we can't benefit from the small baseline effect anymore. And so that can be tricky for founders, right? Because if everybody, you're expecting the seasonality, everybody's telling you there's seasonality, and then there's not in the first year of commercialization, and you're doing a fundraising, and you're going to promise through a business plan what you're doing, to your point, Shub, right? Because of the first year of commercialization, you might be in this almost rat race. You might be putting yourself into this rat race. And so that's something where it takes a little bit of mature thinking to say, hey, just because it didn't happen in the first year doesn't mean it won't happen in the future as I'm growing. So there, you're doing yourself a favor if you're actually not... I don't want to say overselling, because it's not it doesn't have to be a mindful or intentional hopium built into your business plan. It could be completely unintentional. So I'm not going to use the word overselling, but perhaps underselling what you think will happen. It could be the right thing to do it, right? So I think that's just a comment on your recommendation. The other thing, for me, the example of the French market with two different outcomes, one being software, one being or tooling, one being transactions, into the exact same seasonality of the business, you're having two different experiences of how you're growing through the seasonality and at different points of the calendar year. Just be aware what you're selling and whether it currently contributes to executing projects like next Monday for your customers, or whether it contributes perhaps in 3 months to executing projects. And if you're aware of that, you can then adjust your distribution and the marketing spend that you have. If you're a software business and I know that in the high season of the month, people are not going to adopt me, but in 3 months from now, then I can adjust my marketing spend accordingly. I can save a ton of money. I can also save a ton of focus. And most importantly, I can save frustration. Because
Yeah.
what you're going to have if you actually amp up a lot of marketing spend and you hype up your team, both on the marketing as well as on the AE and SDR side, into, hey, this is going to be high season for the business, let's sell as much as possible. And then you're getting an underwhelming outcome because actually your software is better suited to be sold later in the year into these customers. You're going to create frustrations in your business. And that creates a rat tail of different problems, organizationally, culturally, etc. So be super, super aware how what you're selling actually fits into the seasonality calendar.
Yeah. Yeah, Patrick. So that's great. So the next thing I want to talk about, and this actually, it may be an excellent idea and the right idea for certain kinds of companies. And I think for most companies that have got close to Series A is almost always a very good option to do. For very early companies, depends on a case by case basis, is if you are at the receiving end of seasonalities in your business, and like most businesses, you will probably be exposed to some seasonalities, try to find something else which will provide you a natural hedge against that seasonality.
That's
Now,
great.
what could this look like, right? This could be you offer another product which is counter-cyclical or counter-seasonal to the core product you offer. Or you target a different customer base or a different customer persona whose buying behavior is somewhat different and holds up during the low season, or you target a different geography within the same country or otherwise, which is again holds up well during the down season. Now, depending on how early you are in your journey and how important it is for you to stay focused, perhaps it's not an option, but it is definitely worth considering. I think in many of our best companies, they have got to where they have today because of their ability to create hedges in the business.
And so let me piggyback off of that thought. I I realize that most founders will have received rather the generic advice of no, stay focused, don't defocus, etc. And in many cases, that is also the right advice. In this case, though, what you're describing, you can be focused if the off-season product or the off-season go-to-market motion or the off-season geography is actually synergistic and enabling the on-season that you're selling. So, for example, you could be having a software product that you're selling during, for you, the on-season, and the off-season could be a service product that's purchased by the same customers, but perhaps by a different persona or a different process, another buy-ready P&L item, one that fits better with the off-season. And one that doesn't need people to get trained or onboarded or changing the infrastructure. But the service could contribute to actually then making the adoption of the software substantially more easy. So that is something that I've unfortunately not seen too often. I've seen it once or twice, and when I've seen it, I've instantly loved it. And the customers, most importantly, have loved it. An example, for example, for my portfolio, we have a payroll software company, which I don't think we've announced it.
I think we haven't.
And so in that, the founding team has been discussing, and is currently in the process of discussing it, whether during certain parts of the calendar year, it would actually make sense to sell the actual payroll services in preparation of an off-season part of the year, then to onboard off of the experience that they've been giving to their clients of the payroll services, saying, hey, you can actually do this yourself by adopting the software. And right now you have down season and everything is slower, etc. So if you can combine, it's not like, oh, I'm selling fishing rods and ice cream, right? So it's not going to be like that.
And I think I think in general, it's a very important skill to develop or an important trait to test in your business, because even if the seasonality is not crippling you, hey, I mean, a lot of businesses that are thriving today are thriving because they knew how to deal with the pandemic coming on, right? A lot of other businesses could not. And that is not to say that a pandemic is a seasonality, or at least I hope a pandemic is not going to be a seasonality for us. But hey, I mean, you can't, as a founder, you can't choose to say, oh my gosh, this is a big challenge and this is not what I had signed up for, and therefore just continue doing what you've been doing. So I think
Exactly.
it's an important muscle to train, because whether we like it or not, you know, a pandemic may come around or a war may happen, or without even realizing, you may be operating in a business or in an industry where perhaps the seasonalities are not the big deal, but a cycle, the ups and downs of the longer cycle, because we've spoken about shipping in a past episode, for example, which is notorious for being cyclical, right?
Yes.
So in that case, you cannot build your business just assuming an upcycle will continue and go along in that fashion.
Yeah.
Uh,
Here, the best advice, perhaps also actionable for the founder. So what you're describing, Shub, what it sounds like to me is that, hey, if you go at a very high speed with your company, and high speed means that not just you're working much, but also you have perhaps certain investment commitments, certain burn, etc. ongoing. All of that, in the context of a startup is a sign of a high speed, where the braking distance that you allow yourself is typically like you need to brake exceptionally quickly in case the conditions around your business change if you're going at that speed. And so here's the analogy. My father, actually, he used to be a semi-professional rally driver, right? And so in rally, what you're doing is that the driver is behind the wheel, and it's a very curvy road, different road conditions, different surfaces from whatever, gravel, snow, mud, asphalt, makes the car react very differently. It can go up, down. You can't see behind perhaps the corner, etc. So you're gonna have like a co-driver who's reading the map and who's giving you commands, leading, so ahead of time. So while you're executing behind the wheel and with a gear shift, one thing, your brain is already processing the next command of what you need to do after the next corner.
yeah,
And so that's the best thing that
that's
CEOs.
a fabulous analogy, by the way.
It really is,
Yeah,
right? So because as a CEO, you need to have those co-drivers that while you're executing at whatever, 300 kilometers per hour, the current strategy, you need to be anticipating, hey, what is going to be there in 3 months? What is going to happen, seasonality, competition, all these things. And then you need to be able to react to them exceptionally quickly, to your COVID point, even if it's not something that you did expect 6 months ago. If your investors that have a global view tell you, hey, actually, there's this thing happening right now, early December 2019 in China, and it's going to be at the European and American airports in February, that's your co-driver telling you,
yeah,
hey, prepare, right? And so that's not important if you're going at a speed of 50 kilometers per hour. You can just keep the, foot on the brake, and you can brake and you'll be fine, etc. But if you're going at the startup speed of 300 kilometers per hour, it's exceptionally important. And practically that means, gather around you people that have different data points, make sure you're listening to them regularly, what they see in the market, what they expect in the market, and then definitely recognize the patterns as you go throughout the years, like seasonality, and plan accordingly.
yeah,
It's such an important skill.
absolutely.
Yeah. Cool. Do we have any other practical advice to deal with seasonality other than, take it easy, chill, and have humor?
I mean, I think just to build on the closing comments from you that you just made, and tying it to the very first point we made, I think it's important, either, as a founder, you pick an investor also who understands your seasonality. So, for example, if your investor is someone who's saying grow at all costs, hey, seasonality is an excuse, what are you doing, etc. Perhaps they're not the right partners for you,
Ooh, that is
right?
very
And
dangerous.
and if you're a VC listening to us, firstly, hey, why are you listening to us? But anyway, but if you're a VC
You should
listening
go
to
to the
us,
tier one podcast.
exactly. So, but if you're a VC listening to us and have somehow hung around all this while, then maybe consider that, hey, maybe construction businesses have seasonality to them, right? And they might have different characteristics to what you've seen in other sectors, and that's something for you to keep in mind.
And there's nothing wrong with it because you can actually design the investments that you're making throughout the year to that seasonality. It's only a problem if you keep stepping on, for example, the marketing spend gas during the off-season times when you actually can't sell. So it's if you're blind to it, if you're linearly approaching what you're doing, that's when it becomes a problem.
Yep.
Great. Shub, our little ritual, anything in your calendar next week that excites you?
So there's a couple of firms I'm very excited about, very different kinds of companies. One trying to, I guess, reorganize the rare earths and minerals involved in the electrification process, and the other combining two interesting themes. One is on the outcome as a service topic that we discussed, taking um, a workflow that has been taken for granted that it will be done by consultants or third-party service providers for a fee typically given to consultants, and automating that with the product. So in other words, replacing what would be done by consultants over, say, a week or two into something that an AI product can deliver comparably in a few minutes. And pairing that with a few other innovations, etc. So I find that also quite compelling. Outside of that, meeting up with some of our old friends like the Bricks and Bytes gang, etc.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, that sounds good.
Yeah.
Actually, I recorded another Bricks and Bytes this morning. They have this new format.
Okay.
And so my favorite thing for next week is that because I was a little bit off the rails, they definitely riled me up intentionally. So thanks, Owen and Martin, on the topic of electrifying everything in the Western markets and
Okay.
EVs, etc. And I'm expecting next week, that's my highlight, that a lot of my ex-energy friends will call me up and say like, hey, how could you say this? And this goes against our agenda, etc. So I'm expecting a
I
few
see.
angry phone
Nice.
calls. That's gonna be fun.
I'm sure that sounds like a fun week to deal with those calls.
Pretty much. All right, sir. Well, thanks for the time. Glad to be back. Glad to have you back.
Absolutely.
And then I'll see you
Absolutely.
again next week.
You will.
Cheers.
All right.